Welcome to The Explainer. Let's just jump right in, shall we? Today, we're taking a really rigorous legal deep dive into a fascinating piece of ancient legislation. We're looking at the opening text of Tractate Chullin. Now, we aren't just going to look at this merely as religious law. Instead, we're actually going to break it down as a complex, highly specific statutory document that outlines a universally critical concept, and that is legal capacity. So if you've ever wondered how ancient legal systems defined exactly who is competent to perform a legally binding action, well, you are definitely in the right place. We're going to analyze the precise mechanics of competence, intent, and supervision.
Here is our roadmap for today. We'll hit 1. The baseline legal presumption, 2. Categories of incapacity, 3. Defining halachic competence, 4. The supervision clause, and finally, 5. Separating action from intent.
Okay, Part 1. The baseline legal presumption. Any well-drafted legal code needs a universal starting point, right? A sort of default assumption that applies across the board, before any special exemptions are even considered. And that brilliantly illustrates what we are dissecting today. So take a look at Exhibit A. This is the complete text of the opening Mishnah in Tractate Chullin. I invite you to read it with me, almost as if it's a piece of binding constitutional text. Everyone slaughters an animal, except for a deaf-mute, an imbecile, and a minor, lest they ruin their slaughter because they lack competence. And for all of them, when they slaughtered an animal and others see and supervise them, their slaughter is valid. Now, on the surface, sure, it might sound like it's purely about agricultural procedure, but scratch beneath the text and it's an absolute masterclass in legal mechanics.
Right off the bat, you can see this stark statutory divide. It starts with this massive, inclusive, sweeping declaration. Everyone slaughters. Boom. That is our baseline rule granting universal legal capacity. But then, literally in the exact same breath, the text pivots sharply with the restrictive exclusionary clause, except for. In legal drafting, this is a classic, really powerful move. You establish a universal rule to set the norm, and then you carve out the precise boundaries of that rule through highly specific exceptions.
Which brings us to Part 2. Categories of incapacity. Since the text explicitly carved out exceptions to our beautiful universal baseline rule, we've got to investigate who exactly is being excluded here. The text gives us 3 specific classes of people: the deaf-mute, the imbecile, and the minor. Now, this grouping isn't arbitrary. The Mishnah isn't just picking random groups of people out of a hat. In ancient Jewish law, these 3 categories are frequently grouped together because they share a very specific underlying legal status: a lack of legally verifiable cognitive intent. The law isn't judging their human worth at all, it's defining their cognitive legal capacity to perform a highly regulated ritual action that fundamentally requires intention.
Moving into Part 3, defining halachic competence.
To truly understand why those 3 specific groups are excluded, we really need to resolve the tension of these exclusions. We do that by clearly defining the underlying legal concept governing them. Halachic competence, at least in the context of this legal system, is defined as the legal capacity to act with purposeful, verifiable cognitive intent, and that goes way beyond the mere physical execution of a task. This is absolutely fascinating. The physical ability to perform an action is totally meaningless in this framework without the legally recognized mind to guide it. Think about it. A minor might have the physical coordination to actually do the act, but because the law does not recognize their capacity for verifiable intent, their physical action holds 0 legal validity on its own.
And we see this exact legal anxiety expressed explicitly right there in the text itself. The Mishnah adds this clarifying clause, lest they ruin their slaughter. Notice, it doesn't say because their hands are too weak. No, the law's anxiety here is entirely about the unpredictable results of an action performed without verifiable cognitive intent. If the actor's mind isn't fully present, legally accountable, and purposeful, the system simply cannot trust the validity of the final result. It's a profound statement about the required marriage of mind and action in the eyes of the law.
All right, Part 4, the supervision clause.
But wait, the Mishnah doesn't stop with simply excluding them. Just as the text gave us a universal rule and then an exception, it now gives us an exception to the exception. It reveals a brilliant statutory loophole that actually reinstates the validity of those excluded groups. Here's how this builds conditionally. Step 1. We have the physical act being performed by the legally incapacitated actor, the deaf-mute, imbecile, or minor. By itself, as we just learned, this fails. But insert Step 2, active supervision by a competent adult who is visually monitoring the process. So what happens? We magically arrive at Step 3, a halachically valid result. The text explicitly states that when others see and supervise them, their slaughter is valid. The visual presence and mental focus of a competent bystander literally overrides the primary actor's legal incapacity. It is an incredibly elegant piece of legal engineering.
Finally, Part 5. Separating action from intent.
We really need to pause and analyze the profound philosophical mechanism that actually makes this legal loophole function. I mean, how exactly can someone else's supervision validate your action? Well, the Mishnah executes a highly sophisticated legal maneuver here. The law essentially cleaves a single deed into two distinct required components: physical execution and cognitive intent. The legally incapacitated actor supplies the raw physical mechanics of the deed, the hands, but the cognitive intent, that required legal mind, is supplied externally by the competent supervisor, the eyes and the brain. The law allows these two different people to merge their respective contributions into one single, legally valid action. The observer's intent retroactively and concurrently validates the actor's physical motion. It is quite literally the legal outsourcing of cognitive competence. How wild is that?
So I want to leave you with this final provocative thought. If cognitive intent can truly be outsourced to a bystander, how does this ancient separation of mind and action challenge our modern concepts of legal culpability and guardianship? Think about modern contract law, proxy decision-making, or even how we view liability today. Are there situations where we still separate the physical doer from the cognitive observer? This ancient text from Tractate Chullin proves that questions of capacity, the mind, and legal action have been sophisticatedly debated for millennia. I really hope this explainer leaves you eager to decode even more legal texts with us. Thank you so much for diving into this with me, and remember to always look for the hidden mechanics behind the rules.